August 24th, 1814. The most powerful nation on earth marched into the capital of a young republic and set it on fire. The president fled. His wife saved a portrait. And by dawn, the White House, the Capitol, and the dreams of American invincibility were burning. This wasn't conquest. This was revenge. 38 years after American independence, Britain came back, not to reclaim colonies, but to punish a nation that had declared war at Britain's most desperate hour. And for one night, they succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. This is the story of Washington, 1814. The night America's capital burned. The night British soldiers ate dinner in the president's mansion before torching it. And the night that would define how both nations remembered or tried to forget a war nobody really won. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into one of the most controversial episodes in the War of 1812, a moment of triumph for Britain, humiliation for America, and uncomfortable complexity for everyone. Because the burning of Washington wasn't a glorious victory or a heroic last stand. It was retaliation, calculated and devastating, that left both sides questioning what they'd become. But before we get to those flames lighting up the Potomac, before we watch the most powerful symbols of American democracy reduced to smoking shells, we need to understand how Britain and America, former colonies and mother country, allies against Napoleon just decades before, ended up at war again. Because without knowing why this war started, you can't understand why British soldiers felt justified burning Washington to the ground. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles and controversial moments lined up, each one as complex as this. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1812, when the United States declared war on Britain at literally the worst possible moment Britain could imagine. Napoleon controlled most of Europe. Britain was fighting for survival, pouring every resource into defeating France. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports, searching neutral ships for contraband and deserters. And those searches infuriated America. British naval captains, desperate for sailors to crew their warships, practiced impressment, stopping American merchant ships and forcibly taking sailors they claimed were British deserters. Sometimes they were right. Many American sailors were indeed British-born, but sometimes they took American citizens, men who'd never set foot in Britain, claiming they looked British or had accents. To America, this was kidnapping. To Britain, it was retrieving deserters during wartime. Neither side would compromise. America also wanted Canada. It's uncomfortable to say plainly, but territorial expansion drove much of American war enthusiasm. Western and Southern politicians, the war hawks, argued that conquering Canada would be easy. A mere matter of marching, Thomas Jefferson supposedly said. Britain was distracted fighting Napoleon. Canada was thinly defended. It seemed like an opportunity too good to miss. Many Americans genuinely believed Canadians wanted liberation from British rule and would welcome American forces. They were catastrophically wrong. When American forces invaded Canada in 1812, Canadian militia and British regulars fought back fiercely. Far from welcoming liberation, Canadians saw Americans as invaders threatening their homes. The war in Canada became a stalemate of failed invasions, burned towns, and mounting casualties on both sides. Neither nation could deliver a knockout blow. It was grinding, pointless, and increasingly bitter. Think about this for a moment. You're an American in 1812. Your government says Britain is kidnapping your sailors and you should invade Canada to stop it. Or you're a Canadian in 1812 and Americans who claim to be liberators are burning your towns. Both sides believed they were justified. Both sides committed acts they'd rather forget. How do you write history when both sides have legitimate grievances and both did terrible things? Drop your thoughts in the comments. By 1814, the situation had changed dramatically. Napoleon abdicated in April, exiled to Elba. Suddenly, Britain wasn't fighting for survival anymore. The greatest military power on earth could finally turn its full attention to the annoying little war in America. And Britain was angry. While Britain had been desperately fighting Napoleon, America had stabbed them in the back, invading Canada and burning York, modern Toronto, in 1813. British troops had watched the Canadian Parliament buildings burn. They hadn't forgotten. Britain's strategy shifted from defense to punishment. An army of battle-hardened veterans, fresh from defeating Napoleon in Europe, would be sent to America, not to reconquer the former colonies. Britain didn't want them back, but to punish them so severely they'd regret declaring war. 3 major operations were planned: invade from Canada, raid the Chesapeake Bay region, and attack New Orleans. The Chesapeake raid had a specific target that everyone understood without saying explicitly: Washington, D.C. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane commanded the British naval forces in American waters. He was blunt about his intentions: retribution, and to cause the government of the United States to feel and remember for years to come. Major General Robert Ross commanded the landing force, about 4,500 British soldiers, most veterans of the Peninsular War against Napoleon. These weren't garrison troops or colonial militia. They were professional soldiers who'd fought at Vittoria, Salamanca, and dozens of other battles. They knew their business. In August 1814, Ross's force sailed up Chesapeake Bay toward Washington. American defenders knew they were coming, but couldn't agree on how to respond. President James Madison, who'd never commanded troops in his life, personally rode out to observe defensive preparations. His Secretary of State was James Monroe, who had military experience but wasn't in command. The actual military commander was Brigadier General William Winder, who was inexperienced and overwhelmed by the crisis. The American defensive force assembled at Bladensburg, a small town northeast of Washington, was a disaster waiting to happen. About 6,000 men total, a mix of regular army, militia, and hastily armed civilians. Most had never seen combat. Many militia units had barely trained together. Officers didn't know their men. Units didn't know each other. It wasn't an army. It was an armed mob hoping courage would substitute for training and coordination. On August 24th, Ross's 4,500 British veterans approached Bladensburg. The Americans outnumbered them, held defensive positions, and had artillery. It should have been, at minimum, a difficult fight. Instead, it became a rout so complete that Americans sarcastically called it the Bladensburg races, because their militia ran faster than the British could chase them. The British advanced in professional columns under American artillery fire. Men fell, but the formations didn't break. They closed to musket range and delivered devastating volleys. American militia, many firing muskets for the first time in their lives, shot wildly and ineffectively. Then British troops fixed bayonets and charged. Most American militia broke immediately, fleeing toward Washington in panic. Some regular army units fought bravely, particularly the sailors manning the artillery, but they were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. The entire battle lasted about 3 hours. American casualties were relatively light, perhaps 100 killed and wounded, because most fled before engaging seriously. British casualties were higher, around 250, because they'd actually fought. But the psychological impact was devastating. The American capital's defenders had collapsed. The road to Washington was open, and nothing stood between British veterans and the symbolic heart of American government. President Madison, who'd ridden out to watch the battle, nearly got captured when the American line collapsed. He fled back to Washington, then fled again when it became clear the city couldn't be defended. Dolly Madison, the president's wife, remained at the White House longer, famously organizing the evacuation of important documents and artwork. The most famous item she saved was Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. She had the frame broken and the canvas rolled up for transport. It's the portrait that hangs in the White House today. By late afternoon on August 24th, British forces entered Washington virtually unopposed. The city was largely deserted. Most residents had fled. The federal government had evacuated. A few citizens remained, either unable to leave or determined to protect their property. General Ross established headquarters and made a fateful decision. The public buildings would be burned. Not private homes, not churches, not civilian property, only the symbols of American government. Ross's justification was retaliation. Americans had burned York's Parliament buildings in 1813. British soldiers had watched Canadian government buildings destroyed. Now, Americans would watch theirs burn. It was methodical, calculated revenge. Some historians argue Ross wanted to avoid the atrocity of burning an entire city. Distinguishing between government property and civilian homes showed restraint. Others argue burning any city, even selectively, violated civilized warfare norms. Both perspectives have merit. British soldiers entered the Capitol building first. It was a magnificent structure, symbol of American democracy, designed to inspire awe. Soldiers piled furniture in the House and Senate chambers, adding rocket powder for accelerant. Then they set it alight. The Capitol's wooden interiors burned intensely, the flames visible for miles. The building's sandstone walls survived, but everything inside, books, furniture, documents, the symbols of legislative government, was destroyed. Next came the White House, though it wasn't called that yet. Officially, it was the President's house. British officers entered to find dinner still laid out, abandoned when news of the battle arrived. According to some accounts, officers sat down and ate the President's dinner, toasting the Prince Regent with Madison's wine, before burning the building. It's a detail Americans remember with humiliation, British with sardonic amusement. Whether it actually happened exactly that way is debated, but it became part of the story both nations tell. Then they burned it. Soldiers piled furniture, added accelerants, and set the building ablaze. The fire was so intense it damaged the sandstone exterior, turning it black. When the building was eventually reconstructed, workers painted the exterior white to cover the smoke damage. That's reportedly when it became the White House, a name born from British fire. The Treasury building burned, the War Department building burned, the State Department building burned. One British officer later wrote that the flames were so bright you could read a newspaper by their light miles away. Washington burned through the night of August 24th to 25th, 1814. The symbolic heart of America, reduced to smoking ruins while British soldiers camped in the streets. But nature intervened. On August 25th, a massive thunderstorm struck Washington, possibly a tornado. The storm was so violent, it killed British soldiers, overturned cannons, and caused more damage than the fires. Some Americans claimed it was divine intervention, God sending a storm to punish British arrogance. British soldiers just wanted to leave the cursed city. Ross ordered withdrawal to the ships. By August 26th, British forces had evacuated Washington, marching back to their vessels in Chesapeake Bay. The immediate strategic impact was minimal. Britain didn't hold Washington, didn't occupy territory, didn't force American surrender. They'd proven they could burn the capital, but so what? The American government relocated to temporary quarters and kept functioning. Congress met in makeshift buildings. The war continued. In military terms, burning Washington changed nothing fundamental about the conflict's trajectory. But psychologically, the impact was enormous. For Americans, it was humiliation beyond measure. The capital of a proud young nation, the city built to embody democratic ideals, had been burned by the former colonial master. The president had fled. The government had evacuated. British soldiers had eaten dinner in the White House before torching it. The shame was profound and lasting. Americans would never forget. For Britain, it was satisfaction mixed with unease. They'd avenged York, punished American aggression, and demonstrated that declaring war on Britain had consequences. But burning cities, even enemy capitals, made everyone uncomfortable. This wasn't defeating armies in glorious battle. It was destroying buildings. Some British commentators criticized Ross's actions as excessive, unworthy of British military traditions. Others celebrated it as justified retaliation. The debate continues among historians today. The burning also failed to achieve Britain's strategic goal. America didn't seek peace terms from a position of weakness. If anything, the burning of Washington stiffened American resolve. When British forces attacked Baltimore weeks later, they faced fierce resistance. The failed bombardment of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner. The burning of Washington, meant to break American will, instead became a rallying point. From a broader perspective, burning Washington illustrated the war's essential pointlessness. Neither Britain nor America wanted this conflict. Britain was distracted fighting Napoleon. America wanted respect and Canadian territory. Both sides committed atrocities. Americans burned Canadian towns. British burned Washington. Neither achieved decisive victory. The Treaty of Ghent, signed December 1814, essentially restored pre-war borders and status. All the fighting, all the burning, all the deaths for nothing. But perhaps most significantly, the burning revealed uncomfortable truths both nations preferred to avoid. For America, it shattered the myth of invincibility. The young republic, so confident in its righteousness, had watched its capital burn while its defenders fled. That wound to national pride never fully healed. For Britain, it raised questions about imperial conduct. Burning cities might be militarily defensible, but was it morally justified? Veterans who'd fought Napoleon with honor found themselves debating whether burning Washington enhanced or diminished British prestige. The physical damage was eventually repaired. The capital was reconstructed, more magnificent than before. The White House was rebuilt, its blackened exterior painted white. Washington rose from the ashes as a symbol of American resilience. But the psychological scars remained. Americans remembered the burning as a moment of national shame, motivating a century of military buildup and determination to never be so vulnerable again. British remembered it with mixed feelings. Pride in military effectiveness, tinged with discomfort about burning a city. Here's a question worth considering. Was burning Washington a legitimate military operation or an atrocity? By 18th and 19th century warfare standards, destroying enemy military and government infrastructure was acceptable. But was burning the symbolic heart of a nation's democracy excessive? And does the fact that Americans burned York first justify British retaliation? These questions don't have easy answers, which is precisely why historians still debate them 2 centuries later. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. The War of 1812 ended without clear victor. America survived, gaining respect as a nation that could fight the world's superpower to a draw. Britain moved on, more concerned with European affairs than American wars. Canada remained British, having successfully defended against invasion. Nobody really won, but everyone claimed victory in their national narratives. Washington today is a city of magnificent monuments and government buildings, the capital of a superpower. Nothing about modern Washington suggests it once burned. But the history is there, embedded in the white paint of the Executive Mansion, in the reconstructed Capitol Dome, in the national memory of vulnerability and resilience. August 24th, 1814, remains the only time a foreign power has captured and burned the American capital. For both nations, the burning of Washington became a moment to forget or reframe. Americans emphasize Dolly Madison's courage, saving Washington's portrait, the storm that drove British away, the resilience that rebuilt. British emphasize the military professionalism, the justified retaliation for York, the calculated restraint in sparing civilian property. Both narratives contain truth. Both omit uncomfortable details. The burning also demonstrates how wars create cycles of retaliation. Americans burned York, so British burned Washington. Each side justified their actions by the other's atrocities. Each side believed themselves righteous. The cycle only ended when both exhausted themselves and negotiated peace. It's a pattern repeated throughout history, retaliatory violence begetting more violence until everyone agrees to stop. In the end, the burning of Washington was a military operation that succeeded tactically but failed strategically. Britain proved they could burn America's capital, but doing so didn't end the war. didn't force American surrender, and didn't achieve lasting strategic advantage. It was revenge, pure and simple, effective, dramatic, and ultimately meaningless in determining the war's outcome. Both nations would have been better served by negotiating peace earlier, avoiding the destruction entirely. The Treaty of Ghent was already being negotiated when Washington burned. News traveled slowly in 1814. The burning happened in August. The treaty was signed in December. But the Battle of New Orleans, the war's largest battle, was fought in January 1815, after peace was technically signed because nobody there knew yet. The entire war's final phase was a tragic farce of men dying and cities burning after the diplomats had already agreed to restore everything to pre-war status. That's perhaps the most sobering lesson from Washington, 1814. Wars often continue long after everyone knows they're pointless, driven by momentum, pride, and the difficulty of stopping violence once started. The burning of Washington didn't need to happen. The war didn't need to happen. But once begun, the machinery of conflict ground on, consuming cities and lives until diplomats thousands of miles away finally wrote the words that made it stop. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told honestly, even when they're complicated. What other controversial moments should we explore? Britain's colonial campaigns, the Opium Wars, the conflicts where neither side was clearly right or wrong? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.